Hi, welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to cover chapter number 5 of the book, The Ending of Time. I just wanted to show you that, excuse the raggedy copy of my book. We are about halfway through. That is, content-wise, we still have 8 chapters to go after this one, so I think we're doing pretty well. So this chapter starts out with a couple of questions that point to the topic of epistemology, or I should say the theory of knowledge, and the mind's relationship to reality, or to put it in simpler terms, to the question, what can we know? And so the questions, the questions this chapter starts off with, I try to sort of reformulate them here and there a little bit to make them more clear, and I will read you 4 questions in sequence. Because sorry, I was distracted by the chief happiness officer of the channel. So you can list some of these questions that the chapter starts off with for better understanding. I will read them in sequence. There are 4 of them. So the first one is the ground an idea? Or is it imagination, an illusion, or a philosophical concept? The second one is, why do we have ideas? The third one, why have ideas become so important? And the fourth one, can we investigate the ground from a mind that is disciplined in knowledge? Now, the answers to those 4 questions will be given throughout the chapter, and hopefully at the end of the chapter you will be able to have an answer to each one of them. The text then, goes on, and we can formulate 2 hypotheses. The first one being, ideas are often taken to be more than ideas. We feel they are not ideas, but a reality. And the second one is, the ground is unknown. I think, fundamentally, there is a critique. There's like an underlying critique here that I sense, and it's a critique of materialism, and more specifically of scientism. I think we had that in the last chapter when we talked about, the need for science to come up with theories and to be based on knowledge, but then one really has to ask oneself, well, what is knowledge based on ultimately? Well, there are theories, it's based on theories, but then as we sort of progress in science, we forget that maybe in the very, very beginning we made some really metaphysical assumptions, and all the theories are based on metaphysical assumptions. So there's a certain past dependency that we're on, and one tends to forget that we're on that past dependency. So we should always bear in mind that we could be wrong, that we could be wrong altogether. And I think that's a healthy quality for any scientist to sort of uphold as they continue to do science. And I think, so these 4 questions and these 2 hypotheses allude to that critique, of scientism, and that we tend to be really self-assured once we have an idea, and then we tend to cling on to that idea, and in so doing it sort of becomes reality. So it's just worthwhile noting that there is this tendency. So really, a distinction then is made between investigating something from the point of view of having concepts such as theories, and between investigating philosophically, meaning without preconception. That's the way they use the word philosophically. So investigation which is rooted in concepts tends to demand proof, manifested proof, and tends to demand certainty. And I think that's another difficulty when we try to investigate what we call the ground, which is unknown. When we try to investigate that, based on certain concepts, and when we try to demand proof for something which might not be provable, so that in itself is a difficulty in this whole endeavor of sort of exploring what the ground could be, So the discussion revolves around the paradox that the ground cannot be known using thought, concepts, or knowledge, but that if it cannot be proven, it might just be an illusion. So we could say that we dismiss the fact that we cannot prove that there is a ground, and therefore we have to, bear in mind the possibility that this might just be an idea and just be an illusion. So let's turn to a short excerpt to clarify this point. Krishnamurti says, suppose you state that there is such a thing, that there is the ground. It is immovable, etc. And I say, I want to find out. Show it, prove it to me. How can my mind, which has evolved through knowledge, which has been highly disciplined in knowledge, even touch that? Because that, meaning the ground, is not knowledge. It is not put together by thought. Yes, as soon as we say prove it, we want to turn it into knowledge. That's it. We want to be absolutely certain so that there cannot be no doubt. And yet, on the other side of the coin, there's also the danger of self-deception and delusion. Of course, the ground cannot be touched as long as there is any form of illusion, which is the projection of desire, pleasure, or fear. So how do I perceive that thing? Is the ground an idea to be investigated, or is it something that cannot be investigated? Right. Because my mind is trained, disciplined by experience and knowledge, and it can only function in that area. And someone comes along and tells me that this ground is not an idea, is not a philosophical concept, it is not something that can be put together or perceived by thought. It cannot be experienced, it cannot be perceived or understood through thought. So, you see, this section of the dialogue revolves around the question that we just discussed before, and that's, is it even possible to pursue the ground when it seems it's not something that can be approached using thought? And so we are in this basic dilemma as human beings, since we rely so heavily on thought, and since we pride ourselves so much, to be, or to be able to think rationally, this might be the wrong way to go about it. So next, the impossibility for a particular mind to reach the ground is emphasized, and a couple of traditions are mentioned that have already proposed to let go of all knowledge. In particular, they allude to Christianity and also Vedanta, they're mentioned and later contrasted. So let's look at in my view, decisive excerpt of the conversation to drive this point home, which is, I mean, the point being that it is impossible for a particular mind to reach the ground. So what should I do? How shall I approach the question? I want to find it. It gives meaning to life. It is not that my intellect gives meaning to life by inventing some illusion, some hope, some belief, but I see vaguely that this understanding coming upon this ground gives an immense significance to life. Well, people have used that notion of God to give significance to life. No, God is merely an idea. Now, forgive me for just continuing on with the dialogue, because that in itself, this question you could discuss for hours. Yes, but the idea contains something similar to the Eastern idea that God is beyond knowing. Most people accept it that way, though some may not, so there is some sort of similar notion. But you tell me that the ground is not created by thought, so you cannot under any circumstances come upon it through any form of manipulation of thought. Yes, I understand, but I'm trying to say that there is this problem, this danger, this illusion, in the sense that people say, yes, that is quite true. It is through a direct experience of Jesus that we come up upon it, not through the thought of God, you see. I'm not able to express their view accurately. Possibly the grace of God? The grace of God, yes. Something beyond thought, you see. As a fairly educated, thoughtful man, I reject all that. Why do you reject it? Because it has become common, first of all. Common in the sense that everybody says that. And also, there may be in it a great sense of illusion created by desire, by hope, and by fear. Yes, but some people do seem to find this meaningful, although it may be an illusion. But if they had never heard of Jesus, they wouldn't experience Jesus. That seems reasonable. So, we're still debating whether or not the ground can be known by an individual mind. And if it cannot be known, whether it can be directly experienced. But then there's a really interesting question interjected, and that is, and they use Jesus as an example, you know. If you didn't have a concept of Jesus, could you experience him, or wouldn't you be able to? So this shows you that this is a debate about, you know, what can human beings know in the first place, and what relationship does knowing have with experiencing, you know? So I think this is key because it highlights the interconnectedness of experience and thought, or the conceptuality of thought. And to me, it is a fair question. You know, can any human experience Jesus or God if they don't first have a concept of it? Another question ensues, which is, can the brain that is conditioned, disciplined in knowledge, free itself by understanding its own limitations? And, you know, if you think about it, one could, as this question sort of points to, one could think that being a human being, having a brain, you're somewhat caught in a system, okay? And we could probably all agree that, you know, we as being in a body live primarily in time-space, so in this four-dimensional, you know, space, time-space. So, and one could easily say that, in as such, and having this brain, you know, that is sort of constantly working, we're somewhat trapped in that existence, you know, and to want to explore what is beyond time-space, you know, what is essentially out of time, is to essentially transcend both the brain, but also transcend time-space. So it's a fair question, you know, to ask if this is at all possible, if you can actually, from within a system, understand that the system is limited, that you are very limited. And so are you actually able to see that, your own limitation? And are you then able to sort of transcend that limitation? So what we've done so far is we have shown how limited the brain is with the tools that it has to offer. Thought, the processing of experiences, or the storing of experiences in the form of memories, or the accumulation of knowledge. And at this point, Krishnamurti appeals once again, quite emotionally, like he usually does, to a fictional character who has seen or touched the ground, to offer some means for other people to follow suit. All right, my thing's running out of battery, so I have to hurry up. So basically what Krishnamurti does, you know, he sometimes in the dialogue, he sort of goes into character, you know. He pretends, I mean, he makes pretend, you know, that he is this character that has already reached the ground, you know, he's seen all that he can see, he has lived, you know, all the experiences you can live as human beings, so he knows all that, you know, he knows about religion, he knows about ideology, and that's not at all, that's all not it. So, but he also claims that he has seen and touched the ground, and then he fairly asks the question, if he was that person, how could he convince other people, or not convince, but how could he help other people to follow suit, you know? So there it goes, this bit of very emotional dialogue. I know when I'm angry, I know when I'm wounded, it is not an idea. I have got the feeling, I'm carrying the hurt inside of me. I'm fed up with the investigation because I have done it all my life. I go to Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and I say I have investigated, studied, looked at them. I say, these are all just words. How do I, as a human being, have this extraordinary feeling about it? If I have no passion, I am not investigating. I want to have this passion that will explode me out of this little enclosure that has built a wall around myself, a wall which is myself. And man has lived with this thing for millions of years, and I have been trying to get out of it by studying, by reading, by going to gurus, by all kinds of things, but I'm still anchored here. And you talk about the ground because you see something that is breathtaking, that seems so alive, so extraordinary, and I'm here, anchored in here. You, who have seen the ground, must do something that will explode or break up this entire, this center, this egoistic center completely. So, in this instance, he talks from the perspective of somebody who has not yet touched the ground, who sort of wants to. And he juxtaposes these two fictional characters, you know, the one that has reached the ground and has sort of, I don't even know what word to use because probably understanding would be the wrong one, but who transcended, you know, the ego or the concept of meanness, who touched the ground, and the other person hasn't. So how can this person translate it to the other person, and how can that person who's tried everything, you know, who had beliefs, who did investigate, who did chastise themselves, who, I don't know, tried all kinds of methods, you know, to transcend the ego. So how can those two characters converse and make the ground accessible to more people? So it is suggested that all attempts to do so by means of using thought or knowledge are bound to fail. Both thought and knowledge would only create an apparent concept of the ground, which of course is not it. We are offered an example of such failure, and that is the claim, God is in you, which tends to emphasize subject-object duality rather than dissolving it. Because if you say God is in you, you know, even though God is in you somehow, you still make a distinction between you and God, you know, by making that very statement. So the question then is reframed to whether there is, or rather whether there can be a relationship between the egoic center of a particular mind and the ground. And David Bohm's short answer to this is no. If you're saying that in some sense the center is an illusion cannot be related to that which is true, because the content of the illusion has no relation to what is true. So let's pick this one statement apart in order to clarify the point. So I would posit three statements to make his point clear. And the first one is, that which we call the ground is not a thing, as in the Latin res, you know, thing, material. Yet it is true. The second one, the egoic center of a particular mind is an illusion. Therefore, thirdly, the egoic center cannot have a relationship with the ground because an illusion cannot be in relationship with what is true. And I think the point here is that, and here we sort of touch on a second large field aside from epistemology. We touch upon ontology, which is the science of beingness, if you want, the philosophy of beingness, you know. So I think the point here is that the ground can be true, meaning actual, even though it's not a thing, which is probably hard for most of you to understand, but the concept behind this is that, you know, something can have substance. Without being a material thing. So from our limited point of view, it might help if we looked at the ground as being an infinite potential, for instance. We could say it's an infinite potential, meaning it's not yet materialized, it's just a potential, it's potentiality. And at the same time, it's more like a quality rather than a thing. So maybe that helps, you know, if maybe that makes it easier for you to understand what the ground could be if you thought of it less as we tend to do as a person, you know, that when we think of God or gods, plural, we tend to have an image of gods which we shouldn't. You know, it's even written in the Bible, you shouldn't do that, but we tend to do that because we are conceptual beings, you know. When we make perceptions in everyday life, when we have sensory perceptions, our brains sort of automatically create concepts. That's the nature of our brains, you know. Maybe you could use a computer analogy again and say, you take in data and it's almost like your sense of seeing is your graphic card, you know, that a computer has, and it creates images, you know. So it's almost impossible for us not to turn thoughts into images, or it seems, anyway, shouldn't get lost in that. But so I think just maybe think of the ground as being more a potential than an actual thing, or an actualized thing, or a manifested thing, and think of it more as a quality, or qualities, or to put it in other words, as long as the particular mind feels that it is an actual separate existing I, which, according to the text that we're reading, is an illusion, it cannot be in relationship with the ground. So only when this identification with this I concept, with the concept of I-ness or me-ness, has been let go of, can such a relationship with the ground begin. And to connect that, what I just said, with the concept of insight that we discussed in earlier chapters, only in instances where the particular mind lets go of this ego or I-ness or me-ness illusion can the brain override thought, and can there be insight. So next, a juxtaposition of faith and science is made. Again, well, I should say, because keep coming back to this point, you know. And they approach both faith or belief or science as sort of routes to reach the ground, different routes to reach the ground. So with the advent of science, they say that the idea of God, we should say the idea of God as we had it in the Western world, was got more and more dismissed and treated as just an idea, you know, and there was much more weight put on materialism and scientism in terms of, I mean, if you study history, you know, with the rationalism was sort of like the turning away from a sort of faith-based society in which the church, you know, had a lot of institutional power. So, and that is meant that point in history. So with the advent of science, the idea of God was dismissed in favor of, you know, rationalism and materialism and scientism. So scientists might have pursued the ground by investigating matter, which some of them claimed. I mean, to be a scientist and to at the same time be a non-believer, you know, you can still investigate whether there is such a thing as God or the ground, but you don't look for it in sort of like an ideal world or a world of thought, but you look for it in matter, in what you actually try to break apart and split apart and stuff like that. And what these scientists discovered is that what they discovered about matter didn't seem to affect them deeply or psychologically. And it's actually David Bohm who makes that remark. And I think, I mean, that's just my you know, I'm not sure if that's true, but I think that's where his own personal history comes into play again. You know, I think I told you before that he was a quantum physicist, and he went through a great deal of grievances with his colleagues because he was sort of ousted, you know, from that inner circle. And for a scientist at that time, that was really harsh, because that meant, you know, not having funds, not being accredited, you know, not being able to publish or pursue your science further. And what I also read into this pretty much is that being a quantum physicist, you come very close to that which is the ground, or could potentially be the ground, but it doesn't seem to have affected his colleagues as much as it has affected him, obviously, because he spent a great deal of his life pursuing those questions, those deep questions, which is part of the reason why he even got together with Krishnamurti to discuss them, you know. And I think he says something along the lines like of, you can be a scientist and just disregard what you find, you know, and just stick to materialism and not have what you find move you in any way. So there's a possibility. So what is being reiterated here, I think, is that no matter which route we take, be it religion or science, if we try to reach the ground simply via thought, through concepts, theories, and knowledge, we cannot reach it. That is, I have to specify or qualify from a perspective of the individual or particular mind. And if you examine that statement and understand what it could be, you reach the conclusion that we cannot reach it or the ground in those ways, because at no point do we let go of the idea of I. And I think that's really the point. And a religious person that believes in God believes that they, a separately existing I, believe in another, a God, whether they consider it a thing, a set of principles, or some faint idea. That's my personal opinion. So my personal opinion, and I hope that became clear before already, is that, you know, claiming to believe in a God while at the same time clinging to the idea of having a separately existing I, separate from everything else, only reiterates dualism, you know. So this mechanism of believing, or simply believing, still leaves you with duality. Even if you claim that God is in you, in everyone, you still distinguish between the yous, the various yous, the I, and a God. And Krishnamurti, I think in 2 or 3 instances in this chapter, says how shocking the event of deconstruction, the event of deconstruction of that self or that I or that me can be. And I think it's a fair point. In esoteric literature, you hear a lot about ego death. And I should say mysticism also, because it's sort of like when there's talk of spiritual or being on a mystical or spiritual journey, you know. To be on a spiritual journey means that at some point you experience ego death, and that can be quite traumatic. And I would qualify and say it's probably I think the trauma, the amount of trauma you experience when you go through ego death is greater when prior to ego death you were following some kind of ideology, and that could be a religion, you know. Could be communism as well, it really doesn't matter. But if you come from a place where you had this really fixed and calcified almost idea of you were having this separately existing self, and you sort of cemented your place in a societal or in a religious sort of community, and you had a really distinctly defined relationship with something else upon which you were able to project, you know, psychologically speaking, projection. I think it's even harder to go through ego death because there's much more to unravel. So Krishnamurti repeatedly speaks of this kind of shock and experience when he says, "It has given me a tremendous shock to discover the truth that all the churches, prayers, books have absolutely no meaning except how we can build a better society," and so on. You know, and it's fascinating when you read this whole dialogue is that you overread such a statement because it's really small, very fast, you know, which is why you should really read this book, not the way I read it, in one sitting in the beginning, and therefore missing like 80% of the value. But you should really read it chapter by chapter and really think through even though thought is overrated, but really, you know, make an effort to understand and to, there's a nice word actually, that's not a word, but to understand instead of understand. So to let it sink in, you know. So in this one statement, basically, there's a lot of content. So one argument could be that religion or any ideology has its place as long as it helps to build a better society, you know. Of course, then we run into the problem of qualifying what is better or worse, you know, and for whom. But so he doesn't dismiss knowledge, or he doesn't dismiss, you know, institutions altogether. He just says that when it comes down to wanting to enter a relationship, or not, we shouldn't even say that, but wanting to touch the ground, you know, that you will have to let go of all of these, at least for a while, till you touched it. And that, as I said, as I explained before, that is coined ego death. David Bohm says, if we could manage to bring this point to order, then it would have great meaning to build a good society. But as long as this disorder is at the center, meaning the perceived ego, we can't use that in the right way. I think it would be more accurate to say that there is a great potential meaning in it all, but it does not affect the center, and there is no sign that it has ever done so. Krishnamurti takes this further. All the works I have done, everything I have done, the ground says, are valueless. And if I can drop all that, my mind is the ground. Then from there I move, from there I create society. And in this sort of side note, you know, in my view, in my personal view, the key to liberation is being encapsulated, which is one has to pretty much drop all kind of identification. And this includes identification with prior experiences, identification with one's own sort of history, identification with what we have come to know, what we have accumulated as knowledge or belief, identification with achievements, and pretty much everything, right down to the identification with the concept that we are separately existing eyes. Not eyes, but eyes, you know. So what is important to note here is that de-identification does not mean negation. And it is not that you negate your prior experiences or knowledge, but you no longer tie it to the idea of an individual consciousness having had the experience or having had the knowledge, if that makes any sense. So it's almost like you, and that's often cited in all this sort of spiritual and esoteric and mystical literature, is that for a while you almost become an observer of the me, you know. And to make this a really practical exercise, so if you experience anger, you know, or any kind of emotion, instead of getting all riled up in that particular emotion and sort of act upon it or react from that kind of place, you observe you're having this emotion and you pretty much say, there is rage. It's an observation. At this very moment, there is rage, or there is fear, or there is something. It's almost like you create this distance of maybe 3 seconds, you know, and that allows you to see that he or she or they who are experiencing this emotion are pretty much a fiction. They're not real, in the sense that they are not ontologically separately existing beingness. So it is about transcending individual consciousness and arriving at what could be described as universal consciousness. This, of course, is not a new concept. It has been described as also as anima mundi, the Latin expression, as a vital force or a principle conceived of as permeating the world. The difference, I think, to the anima mundi concept is probably that we no longer think in terms of a soul, which we also tend to ascribe substance to. So if we were to replace, you know, I-ness or me-ness or ego with having or being a soul, a single soul, we would probably make the same mistake. You know, we would just attach to another sort of concept. We just replaced I-ness or me-ness with the concept of soul. So that's, again, just my personal opinion. So maybe we can use this simple statement, I am, as an example. I guess the message in this chapter, or message of this overall book really, is that one should focus on the I am part of the I am. Focus on the being or the beingness and let go of the I. So my phone is about to die, and that concludes today's session. I hope you liked it. If you have, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.